It was meant to be a symbol of unity. Species from across dozens of worlds sitting together, sharing food, training to become the next generation of officers and soldiers. The hall stretched wide, rows upon rows of long metal tables, illuminated by overhead panels that cast a sterile white glow across the room. Trays clattered, voices mingled, and the air was thick with the distinct scents of meals tailored to alien diets, the tang of roasted kelth meat for the reptilian trillans, the earthy pollen cakes favored by the avian alari, and the sharp spice that accompanied nearly everything the insectoid chirix ate. In the midst of all this sound and life, there was one corner that remained painfully quiet. At the end of a nearly empty bench, away from the clusters of cadets, sat a girl who seemed as though she did not belong. Her name was Ziril. She was Veyari. To most of the academy, that single word was enough to define her. The Veyari were a broken people, a species that had once dared to resist the Federation and paid the price. Their worlds had been stripped, their fleets dismantled, their population reduced to servitude. Generations later, though officially citizens, they still carried the stigma of defeat. To the galaxy, the Veyari were weak. They were beggars. They were outcasts. And in the eyes of the cadets, Zyril was a living reminder of that. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table, as if by looking away she could vanish into the shadows. Her pale lavender skin had a faint, almost sickly sheen beneath the artificial lights. Her uniform was clean but loose, hanging from her frame in a way that betrayed just how little she ate. Her hair, silken and silver, fell across her face like a veil, hiding her wide luminescent eyes that rarely dared to meet another's gaze. In front of her was nothing. No tray, no food. Not even the bland nutrient paste that most of her kind resigned themselves to. Hunger gnawed at her belly, sharp and cruel. She had felt it before. She was used to it. The credit system at the academy was designed to be fair in theory, but in practice it was biased. Food portions were expensive, and the stipend her people received was barely enough for the cheapest, most tasteless option. That morning, her card had flashed red at the dispenser. Insufficient credits. The embarrassment still burned in her chest. Now, she sat with empty hands while around her the room filled with laughter and the sound of others eating their fill. Some cadets threw her sidelong glances, snickering as they tore into their meals. A few made no effort to hide their disdain. "Look at her," one whispered, the hiss carrying just far enough. "Starving already." She should be used to it. "Veyari thrive on scraps," another added, drawing a ripple of cruel laughter. Jarell lowered her head even further, cheeks flushing with humiliation. She did not answer. She never did. She had learned long ago that silence was survival. If she fought back, they would only push harder. If she pretended not to care, perhaps they would forget she was there. But the laughter still stung. Each word was like a needle, reminding her of her people's place in the galaxy. And yet, someone was watching her. At a nearby table, a human cadet leaned back in his chair, arms folded loosely across his chest. His name was Daniel Hayes, though few in the academy knew much about him yet. Humanity was still considered a newcomer to galactic affairs, unpredictable and difficult to categorize. They were hardy, yes, but their culture was strange. Equal, parts aggressive and compassionate, pragmatic yet stubborn. Daniel's gaze had been drawn to Zirel from the moment he entered the cafeteria. He saw the way she sat apart, the way the others avoided her, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long on trays piled high with bread, fruit, and hot meals before darting away in shame. He knew that look. He had seen it back home, in the poorer districts of Earth where children pretended they weren't hungry while watching others eat. Hunger, he realized, wasn't bound to one species. Hunger was universal. The noise of the cafeteria continued, but for Zarel, the world had shrunk into silence. She stared at the table, pretending not to notice the faint stares or whispers. Her empty hands trembled against her lap, her body screaming at her for food she did not have. Hunger, humiliation, invisibility. This was her daily ritual. Then a shadow fell across her table. Cyrell's wide, glowing eyes flicked upward. A human stood there. He was taller than most, his posture casual yet solid, with a tray in one hand. His uniform jacket was half unzipped, his brown hair messy in a way that made him seem perpetually at ease. She recognized him, Daniel Hayes. They had never spoken. He was not one of the ones who mocked her, but he had never interfered either. She expected him to sneer, or worse, sit too close just to mock her emptiness. But instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked in a voice that was calm, almost friendly, "Room for one more?" For a moment, Zarel froze. Words tangled in her throat. No one had ever asked to sit with her, not once since she arrived. The very idea was absurd. I suppose," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the clatter of trays and chairs around them. Without hesitation, Daniel set his tray down with a solid clack and slid into the seat across from her. He didn't glance at the others, didn't care that half the room was now watching. He simply placed his fork on the tray and looked at her as though she were anyone else. Her gaze flickered to the food on his tray. Bread, thick slices of roasted, protein cuts, a pile of fruit, and even a steaming cup of broth. It wasn't extravagant by most standards, but compared to the nothing in front of her, it might as well have been a feast. Her throat tightened as she swallowed the lump of longing. Daniel noticed. He leaned forward, his hand nudging the tray slightly closer to her. Eat. The word was simple, direct. Not a question, not pity. A command given with warmth. Cyrell's breath caught. I can't, she stammered. Her hands remained folded, clutched tightly together. It's yours, Daniel smirked, leaning back in his chair with an ease that contrasted sharply with her tension. What kind of man sits down at a table and doesn't share with his guest? Eat. Her fingers trembled. No one had ever spoken to her that way, not as a parasite, not as a burden, but as if she were worth a seat, worth a share. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingertips brushed the crust of bread. She expected him to pull the tray back, to laugh at her desperation, to reveal the cruel joke. But Daniel only watched, his expression unreadable except for the faintest of smiles. She tore off a piece of bread and brought it to her lips. The flavor hit her like a shock. Simple, warm, real. Her people once shared meals in sacred rituals of trust, but those traditions had been buried under centuries of humiliation. Now, tasting food freely given, something inside her cracked open. She devoured another bite, then another, too quickly. Embarrassed, she slowed, forcing herself to chew carefully, to savor rather than consume like an animal. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. Across the room, the noise had shifted. Conversations dimmed. Whispers spread. Cadets turned to watch the human feeding the Vayari girl, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disgust. "Is he serious?" one muttered. He gave her food. Humans, they really are strange. Daniel didn't acknowledge them. He leaned back in his seat, sipping his broth as if nothing unusual was happening. "See?" he said with a small grin. "Not so bad when you're eating with company." Zarel could not speak. Her throat was too tight, her chest too full. She nodded instead, clutching the bread like it was the first real thing she had ever been given in this cold place. For the first time in months, her stomach began to fill. For the first time, she felt more than invisible. The next morning, the academy halls buzzed with whispers. Gossip traveled faster than any data stream. Everyone had seen it, one human sharing food with the Vayari girl, Something so simple had shaken the unspoken order of the cadet corps. Daniel didn't care. He walked with his usual stride, shoulders loose, hands in his pockets, as if daring anyone to confront him. When he entered the cafeteria, he saw her immediately. Zirel, seated in her usual corner, her posture the same as always, though her eyes lifted just slightly when he appeared. A flicker of something, hesitation, maybe even hope, lit her face before she quickly looked down again. Daniel collected not one tray, but two. He balanced them easily as he crossed the room, ignoring the sudden hush. The clatter of utensils dimmed, replaced by murmurs and the low hiss of disgust. He set one tray before her, sliding it gently across the table. "This one's yours," he said simply, before sitting down with his own. The silence that followed was heavier than the day before. Zirel's hands hovered uncertainly over the tray, her glowing eyes darting from the food to the faces watching them. She looked as though she were caught in a spotlight, every breath too loud. And then came the sneer. A Trillan cadet, scaled, broad-shouldered, and arrogant, stepped closer. His clawed hands slapped against the table, making the trays rattle. His mouth pulled back in a toothy grin. "Careful, human," he drawled, his voice a low hiss. "Share with her too long and you'll starve yourself. Veyari are parasites. Everyone knows it." Daniel didn't look up immediately. He cut into his protein slice, chewed, swallowed. Only then did he raise his eyes, calm and unbothered. "Funny," he said, voice steady but carrying across the hall. "I didn't see you offering her food when she needed it." A ripple of laughter broke out, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was surprised, nervous. The Trillan's scaled face darkened, his teeth baring. "Watch yourself, ape," he snarled. "She's beneath us all. You'll sink to her level." Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. His expression was relaxed, but his words were sharp as blades. "Then maybe your level isn't worth standing on." The silence that followed was thunderous. Zirel's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, heart racing. No one had ever spoken for her before, not in years. The Veyari had learned silence as survival. They had taught their children never to resist, never to draw attention, never to provoke. Because to speak was to invite cruelty. But Daniel had spoken, and he hadn't just spoken, he had challenged. The Trillan's claws scraped the metal of the table, his rage barely contained. But before he could reply, one of the instructors barked from across the room. "Enough!" The tension broke. The Trillan snarled low in his throat and stalked away, his pride wounded, but his fury far from gone. Daniel returned to his meal as though nothing had happened. "Eat," he reminded Zirel gently, nodding to her tray. Her hands shook as she lifted a piece of fruit. The room still watched, but she forced herself to take a bite. Sweetness flooded her mouth and tears threatened to burn her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. Later, the threats began. In the dorms, whispers hissed through the corridors. Cadets leaned close to Daniel, their words edged with menace. "Stop feeding her, stop sitting with her, or you'll regret it." But Daniel only smirked. Humanity, he thought, had never been known for bowing to pressure. His people had stood against worse than petty cadet politics. His people had fought wars, clawed their way through extinction events, survived planets that others deemed uninhabitable. And now, he thought, if the galaxy wanted him to stop sharing his food with one hungry girl, too bad. The next day, he walked into the cafeteria carrying 2 trays again. He set one in front of Zirel without hesitation. "Yours." Her eyes glistened as she looked at him. Not with pity, not with shame, but with something unfamiliar, something fragile and new, gratitude. Around them, the whispers grew sharper, angrier. But they could not drown out the simple act unfolding in the corner of the hall, a human refusing to let cruelty stand, a Vayari girl finding strength in a gift she thought forever lost. By the third week, Daniel's defiance was no longer an isolated act. It had become a pattern, daily, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Every morning he collected 2 trays. Every afternoon he sat at the same table, and every evening Zyril ate food she never thought she would taste again. What began as whispers had grown into open debate among the cadets. Some muttered with contempt, rolling their eyes at the strange human habit of feeding the weak. Others, however, began to question what they had taken for granted. "Why does she deserve to starve?" one Alari asked in a hushed voice. "She's Vayari," came the reply. "That's just how it is. But the human, he makes a point." Zyril felt it in the shifting air. The stares were still there, still sharp, but something had changed. Not all eyes were filled with scorn anymore. Some were merely curious. A few, just a few, carried uncertainty. The instructors noticed too. During training drills, Zyril had always been dismissed as too weak, too frail to keep pace with the others. She was assigned lighter weapons, shorter runs, easier tasks. Yet with real food in her stomach, her body began to respond. She moved with more energy, her reflexes sharpening. The first time she completed the obstacle course without collapsing, her chest heaving with pride, Daniel clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Knew you had it in you." That night, Zyril lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, for so long she had believed her fate was fixed. Weak, forgotten, a shadow of her people's former glory. But now, with every meal she shared with Daniel, she began to feel something stirring deep within her, something she thought the galaxy had stolen from her people forever. Hope. One evening, as they sat across from each other with their trays, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had gnawed at her since the first day. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel glanced up, his fork halfway to his mouth. He chewed, swallowed, and then shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "Because no one should starve while others eat," her brow furrowed. "But you risk yourself. They hate me. They'll hate you too." He leaned back in his chair, his grin lopsided but unwavering. "Let them. Humans have a saying. You measure someone's character by how they treat the ones they think they can ignore." The words struck her harder than any insult ever had. She lowered her gaze, blinking fast against the sting in her eyes. To be treated not as invisible, not as shameful, but as someone worth standing up for. It was a weight her heart struggled to bear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed with its usual chaos, but at their table there was only silence, broken only by the quiet clink of utensils. Finally, Zyril whispered, "On my world, long ago, to share a meal was sacred. It was a bond, a promise of trust. We lost that tradition after the war. No one would share with us anymore, not even our own sometimes." Daniel studied her, his expression softening. "Then maybe it's time you had it back." Her throat tightened. She bowed her head, unable to find words strong enough. The next day, during combat drills, something remarkable happened. Paired against a sneering cadet who had mocked her for weeks, Zyril moved with surprising speed, fueled, steady, and longer weakened by hunger, she dodged his strike and disarmed him in a single fluid motion. The shock on his face was priceless. For the first time, cadets whispered not about her weakness, but about her strength. That night, Zyril did not cry herself to sleep. Instead, she replayed the moment over and over, the strike, the dodge, the victory, and every time she saw Daniel's proud grin when she returned to the bench, his voice teasing yet warm. "Told you, you could do it." The chains she had worn all her life, chains of shame, of silence, of hunger, were beginning to crack. All because one human had decided that cruelty was not acceptable. All because he had offered her a seat, a tray, and a place at his side. The mess hall was different that night. Not because the walls had changed, or because the lights glowed any softer. They hadn't. But because whispers had turned into silence, and silence had turned into something heavier, something expectant. Every alien cadet who had once smirked at Lyra's trembling hands or at her empty plate now found themselves staring not at her frailty, but at the way she walked beside Ethan. The human's stride was easy, natural. His tray balanced in one hand, the other holding a simple ration pack he had promised her. Lyra moved carefully, her steps still hesitant, but her head no longer bent low. She wasn't trying to disappear anymore. She walked like someone who had been seen. Ethan led her to a table near the center, not the corner where she used to hide, not the shadows where she had starved unseen. It was the middle where everyone's eyes could not help but follow. When he sat down, he motioned to the empty space beside him. "Sit here. With me." Lyra's throat caught. The phrase was so simple, yet it echoed like a command that shook an empire. She set her tray down, hands trembling, not from hunger this time, but from the weight of the moment. She sat. She belonged. For the first time in cycles, she ate without fear. Ethan had split his meal again, half for himself, half for her. It wasn't much, just bread, protein cubes, and some broth, but to Lyra it tasted richer than any feast her noble bloodline had once afforded her. Every bite was an act of defiance against the cruelty of the academy. Around them, cadets whispered. Some sneered, some shifted uncomfortably, others simply watched. One bold voice muttered, "Humans always meddle. They don't know their place." Ethan didn't even glance up. He simply tore another piece of bread, dipping it into the broth before sliding it onto Lyra's tray. His calmness was louder than any retort could have been. Lyra finally looked up from her food, her silver eyes shimmering. "Why?" she whispered. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why what?" "Why do this for me? You could ignore me like the others. It would be easier." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Because no one deserves to starve. Not in front of me, not ever. That's all." The simplicity of his answer stunned her. For her people, compassion was often currency, calculated and traded for influence. For him, it was instinct. That night, spread through the academy like fire. By the next cycle, fewer cadets laughed when Lyra entered the hall. By the third, some even offered her scraps, awkwardly, as if trying to mimic what Ethan had done. By the fifth, she had her own tray of food, still modest, still barely enough, but hers. The transformation wasn't sudden, nor was it complete. Prejudice lingered, cruelty did not vanish, and whispers still followed her. But the spell of her, isolation, had been broken. Ethan had not saved her with speeches or fists. He had saved her by making space at his table. Weeks later, during a survival exercise, Lyra returned the favor. The cadets had been dropped on a barren moon, supplies scarce. Hunger gnawed at all of them, even Ethan. By the third day, when his strength faltered, it was Lyra who pressed her ration bar into his palm. "You shared with me," she said softly. "Now I share with you." Ethan's grin was tired but warm. "Guess that makes us even." Lyra shook her head. "Not even. Connected." Their bond became something the Academy couldn't explain, and the galaxy beyond it couldn't easily dismiss. Where others saw lines between species, they saw something else. Common ground, built one meal at a time. Years later, when both stood, not as cadets but as officers of the fleet, stories of their friendship spread far beyond the Academy walls. Some called it legend, others dismissed it as rumor. But those who had seen it knew the truth. A single act of kindness had reshaped more than one life. At every council table, whenever aliens debated humanity's place in the stars, Ethan and Lyra sat side by side, and though battles would come, though wars would rage, there was always this memory between them, the night an alien girl had been left to starve, and the human who said, "Come eat with me."